Rick Rule. Rick is the chairman of Sprott US Holdings and has made a name for himself with his outstanding record as a very successful money manager in the resource sector. Rick, what I like about Rick is a quote he used to say, but I haven't heard him saying in the recent past, but he has said in the past, our biggest problem is within our 2 years. Today, Rick will talk about water, the coming collective catastrophe. Rick Rule.
Thank you, Jayant. I think most of you in the room know I'm coming off my own conference for the last 4 days. Many of you were there. And it reinforces in my mind the difficulty of putting on a gathering like this, analogous to cat herders. So I'd like you to join me in a round of applause for Jayant and Rajni for putting on this. That despite the fact that Jayant and Rajni are closet racists. This is demonstrated by the fact that they scheduled me last between you and beer to talk about something as insignificant as water. I've enjoyed this conference for many years. The high intellectual tone, the different points of view, but particularly the high intellectual tone. And I have to tell you, that's over. Okay? Every speaker that does a good job, of course, modifies his or her speech to take into account things that have happened earlier in the day that are fresh in people's minds. And I have to do that too. I have to refer back as an example to Albert Liu's speech and remind you that for the first time in Vancouver's history, a white guy outsmarted a Chinese guy. I let him chase me till I caught him. It's interesting too, Doug's description of humans as dogs. What variety of dog is Doug? Or Albert? Or Jayant? I'll leave that to your imagination. Or Rick, that's right. The other thing that's amusing to me about Doug's speech, you know, Doug forgets to remember that Jayant tapes these things and posts them on YouTube. And as interesting as these speeches are, I can assure you, go to the channel and look at the comments below, because YouTube is a public forum. Some of the comments in years past have been interesting, but the comments to Doug's speech this year will be better than all of the combined archives of Capitalism and Morality. Finally, before I talk about what Jayant has asked me to talk about, I want to talk about this discussion in the continuum of my own conference, where every speech defined the human condition as deplorable and getting worse. I remember Gary Alexander in late 1999 at Doug's famous Eris conference. I was driving with him to Doug's house, and I was saying, you know, Gary, I don't know very much about technology, but I think this Y2K thing is a little bit overblown. Am I naive? He said, no, Rick, no. Our group, particularly the libertarians, need to form a 12-step self-help group called Apocalypse Anonymous, where we understand that we have a problem with the human condition, and we understand that the problem is larger than our ability to endure. We have to ask for help from a higher power, and we have to have continuing community reinforcement. When I think about everything we've heard so far, and by the way, I'm going to be complaining in my speech too, don't get me wrong. But when we think about everything that we've heard about in the last 4 or 5 days, I'm remembered of my favorite social scientist. That's Robert Friedland, my favorite because he's made my clients so much money and made me look smart. Describing the circumstance of the conference as saying, yes, our condition is hopeless, but it's probably not serious. In a final nod to an earlier speaker, I've changed the name of my speech today to Water, the Miracle of Drought, because it resembles the miracle of poverty. The fact that a commodity that is as valuable and ubiquitous as water is in short supply, and that condition will become worse, is a sort of a testament to the skill for self-destruction that collectivist political organizations are capable of delivering. Water is, of course, a public good. What does that mean? It means that it defies modern physics. In modern physics, valuable commodities flow uphill to money, but water flows downhill to votes. And we'll talk about that in the context of water shortages, amazingly, even in the greater Vancouver Regional District. In Vancouver, the problem with water traditionally, before we focused on a solution, was that there was too much of it. It takes special talent to have a water problem in an area as prone to flooding as Vancouver, but that's the nature of a public good. And here's the nature of the problem. Well, no, that's not right. Here's a description of the problem. Water costs less than it's worth. You pay less for water than it's worth. Consider this. In California, where we, including my wife and I, lavish landscaping on a 1-acre parcel in the desert. In California, where I live, it costs about 1/10 of a cent to have enough water to flush your toilet. Now, of course, these are modern, low-flow conservation toilets, so you have to flush them twice. But even at that, it costs 1/5 of a cent to fulfill the function associated with flushing a toilet. What would you pay? Think about what you would pay. The truth is that we distribute water based on our perception of society's need, with no thought to the utility of water. Pretty stupid. But what gets more stupid is that it is priced below cost. So in addition for selling for less than it's worth, it costs less than the provision of the service. And this is where the problem begins to get truly pernicious, because of course water is distributed to votes, not to utility. I'm reminded of the quote, Doug, you always have to help me with this. Maybe it was Mencken. Somebody described elections as advanced auctions of stolen property. Thank you. And there's nothing that illustrates this so well as water. It was said, I think, by Mark Twain, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting over. And we have the fight in the political arena, and we'll talk about this more and more. But I want to describe some of the problem for you. One example is that around the world, water is delivered by governments in return for political power as a political favor. A favor to farmers, a favor to industrialists, a favor to anybody who will be high bid in the political auction. And the problem with that increasingly is that the revenue from water, paltry as it is, flows to the general budget, while the costs of water are specific. And the costs of maintaining water infrastructure are investments in the future that never, ever, ever buy votes today. It's estimated by the Congressional Budget Office, which makes it almost certainly incorrect, above or below, that the unmet needs for water infrastructure in the United States are $13 trillion. Now, we're exposed to so many numbers with regards to public expenditure. $20 trillion in recourse liabilities at the federal level, $108 trillion in non-recourse liabilities at the federal level. That when I say $13 trillion to this room, nobody's eyes blink. You realize that's 12 zeros? I mean, it's an astonishing amount of money. $13 trillion in infrastructure needs. It's estimated that in New York City, 2/3 of the water that enters the system in the reservoirs in the Catskills flows out of the system before it reaches taps in New York City. The water infrastructure was installed in the 1910s and 1915s and hasn't been upgraded since then. Solving a problem for the future doesn't buy you votes in the present. And this circumstance is repeated around the world, including, ironically, in a rainforest called Vancouver, where the existing water infrastructure is insufficient. It makes me laugh every time I think about it. Anyway, I think the metaphor of the miracle of drought is really, really appropriate. What are the problems? And you need to understand two words here. One is voidage. Voidage is a really weird word. Only lawyers could dream up this word. Voidage, in water terms, is where you take water that has already been assigned to the high bid in the political auction, and you use it for some other purpose. Specifically, around the world, the word was actually originally from Australia, but is now all the rage in California. Voidage is where you take water in particular that has been assigned to agricultural usage, because agriculture used to be a bigger part of the economy, and hence the farmers won the advanced auction for water. The farmers got subsidized for water before anybody else. What's changed in the last 100 years, of course, is that water's become an increasingly small part of the economy, and other users are looking to re-steal the water that was stolen by the farmers. Farmers are a smaller percentage of the economy now. So as an example, in California, the city of Los Angeles, fair and square, went and bought the Owens Valley, took the water. Because the farmers couldn't compete with the city of Los Angeles in 1910, it was suggested that that water was stolen. Well, that's not strictly speaking true. They bought it. The consequence of that is that the farmers who at that point in time still controlled California politics made sure by legislation that they would never have to compete on an economic basis for water again. They stole the water fair and square. They outvoted the city of Los Angeles. The consequence of that is that now that California agriculture consumes 86 or 87% of the water consumed in the state, while they contribute 3% of the state GDP, there's a reorganization of the political force. The rest of the state is trying to steal back the water that was stolen by the agriculturalists, and they've had to invent this word called voidage. The other word that you're going to have to understand to make this talk work for the rest of you is recharge. Recharge is an interesting concept for you to understand because water is interesting as a market and as a commodity. It is a need, clearly. Everybody knows it's a need. It's a need to grow food. It's a need in every other thing. But it's not a market yet. There isn't a market for water in most of the world. There is a market for world, ironically, in the third world, where women have to carry on their heads. If they do that and bring it back to the village, they can actually sell it because the governments are too disorganized at a local level to steal. But in the West, as you've correctly identified, we're very, very well organized. So we've organized this theft in a much better fashion than they've ever managed to organize it in India. It's mobile. It's bloody hard to own this stuff because it's hard to contain. You put it on your property, particularly if it falls by way of rain, and the damn stuff escapes, you know? So it's really hard to own the stuff, and it's really easy to degrade. In other words, you can take water in various forms, you can use it, and you can degrade it. Mercifully, as we'll learn in a minute, it's not too hard to restore. The only thing that stands between us and restoring it is it's cheaper to steal it than to retreat it. I think you get where I'm going with this. We have a commons problem, a classic commons problem. So, one consequence of the fact that water is a need, but not a market, is, as we've discussed, we've had massive underinvestment in water infrastructure. Water is not distributed based on utility. If water were distributed based on utility, there would be a market. And there are finally emerging markets. The Darling Basin is an example in Australia and in northern Chile. Improper markets, markets with losers, markets with winners, markets with political interference, to be sure, but markets nonetheless. The idea that water distribution is more efficient in the Atacama Desert than it is in Vancouver is truly amazing to me. Maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe scarcity is the mother of invention. Storage is extraordinarily inefficient with regards to water, precisely because it's a public good. it was easy to store water in reservoirs in the US Southwest. And it's easy today because the reservoirs exist. But in reservoirs like Powell and Meade and Mojave, over half of the water impounded in the reservoir is lost to evaporation. Because water was so cheap, it was okay to waste half. But it's not okay to waste half anymore. Water stores very well underground, extremely well underground. But it's expensive to put it there. It's expensive to take it out. And if you don't price water according to either cost or worth, you are more inclined to waste water than you are to use water intelligently. So let's talk about that a little bit. I'm from, it was interesting hearing Jayant complain about India, which he's familiar with. I'm from another kleptocracy called the People's Republic of California, and so rather than insult Indians at least too much, I'll insult my own state. In my own state, we mercifully have just this spectacular geology for water. We have these spectacular aquifers, and whoever was responsible for Earth did a wonderful thing for us, which we're doing our very best to degrade. We have this great reservoir called the Sierras. Water falls in the form of snow. It gets stored up there really well, and it gets delivered to us by gravity. And as it comes down the hill, it hits these big sedimentary basins, and it goes underground where it can't evaporate. It's really cool. It gets stuck in between these platelets in the rock, and it gets stored away from evaporation. And the coolest thing of all is that the water comes in there in very poor quality. Dissolved solids, the engineers call it. You and I would call it mud. And as it goes underground and comes back out, these platelets, the aquifer, strips the mud out. Dirty, lousy water goes in. Clean, pure, pretty water comes out for free. And in California, we've managed to defeat this. I mean, this takes really special skill. What we've done is we've ignored the second word that you have to learn, recharge. Recharge is the ability of an aquifer, the ability of a basin to accept, in the winter, during high flow periods, water, store it, and give it up when the water is pumped out in the summer without destroying the productive capacity of the aquifer. My friend Winston Lambert sent me a couple of articles in preparation for this speech that describe the subsidence of these wonderful aquifers in California, where we've pumped out so much water that the surface level of the ground has declined by 20 or 25 feet. Now, that's one problem. But a bigger problem is when you have this subsidence, two ugly things happen. These basins are formed of interfingered bands of clay and sand and gravel, in effect. And as you pump the water out of these interfingered members, as the clay dries, it doesn't absorb any more water. So if you try and introduce water from the top into this clay member, the clay member, which used to be porous, which used to conduct water and distribute water, resists water. And the platelets, the sand and gravel, these interfingered members like this, look at my fingers as the sand and gravel, and look at the spaces between my fingers as the pores that store the water. When you pull the water out, the platelets collapse. And again, they form an impermeable member where the normal processes of percolation become resistant. Now, it turns out that there's an easy technological solution to this. This problem was faced in South Texas in the Rio Grande Basin in the 1960s. What do you do? Jean-Marc, you can figure this out. What do you do when you have an impermeable barrier that causes water that comes down to distribute rather than to percolate? What would you do? You're close. You're very close. You drill through it, and you reflood it from the bottom. In other words, it's impermeable from the top, but you reflood it from the lower members. It's a spectacular solution. It could work in California. It could work in the Darling Basin. It does work in Chile, because they have to be wise with water. They don't have a choice. It could work in California. Why doesn't it work in California? Cost, you have half. It's illegal. It's illegal. You are interfering with the aquifer to restore it. And you're interfering with it for a couple reasons. One, some of the water that you put on your property could go to somebody else's property. In other words, it's illegal to accidentally subsidize the guy next door. Now,
It's not illegal to take water.
I mean, on my honor as a stockbroker, I'm not making this up. I mean, this is, well, it's kind of illegal to steal the guy's water. You can pump, but you're not supposed to drill a well under your neighbor's land. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so what you have really is a commons. You have a water war. You have no incentive, as water law sits today, to conserve and preserve your part of an aquifer. You have an incentive to outpump your neighbor, who will outpump you if you don't outpump him. You have an incentive, in fact, not to conserve. Typical commons problem. You don't have an incentive not to overgraze if your neighbor is going to expand his flock as you practice sensible circumstances. So it's interesting that unlike other parts of, unlike other markets, unlike other, at least property markets, because this asset is mobile, it requires cooperation amongst owners to maximize the utility for everybody. What is the best system? Think about a basin. The water falls up here, comes down here, mercifully by gravity. It stores itself subsurface if it stores itself well. It's used. It's degraded as people pump waste into the aquifers, as they pollute the water. It eventually goes out to sea and becomes much less usable for humans unless we spend lots and lots and lots of money on it. So the first circumstance, the first problem that we have to solve is this basin-wide problem, which requires the cooperation of many users. The second thing is smaller than the entire basin, the aquifer. This aquifer might be owned by 7 or 8 different people. And as Winston points out, under current water law, the right thing that you do is just pump the hell out of the basin. Wreck it before your neighbor could wreck it, so you can turn it into almonds faster than he can. What's the best system that you can think of for voluntary cooperation among numerous parties? Anybody have an answer?
Capitalism.
You're close. A market.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we have a form of voluntary cooperation. It's worked kind of for a long time. There are winners, there are losers. You don't think there's winners and losers in a political auction? We're all going to be losers in this political auction. There will come a time in the People's Republic of California when people that use the smallest of all gate valves, a faucet, turn the gate valve to the right and nothing comes out. And in that circumstance, which by the way I'm looking forward to, we're all going to be losers, because in that failure, I think will be born the possibility, at least, of success. If you think about the politics of California right now, this auction's over, right? The process by which we redistribute the water is extremely messy. Where I live in Carlsbad, rather than fight the political fight to buy or steal water from other constituencies in the state of California, what we've chosen to do is build this great big desal plant. Now, water in the winter in California, water that has mud in it, low quality water, at times when water is very, very, very available, costs between $50 and $100 an acre foot. That's what it costs. The right thing to do is to buy this water in the winter, store it underground. It costs $25 or $30 an acre foot to inject it. Pull it out in the summer. You put it in here, you pull it out 300 meters away. Mercifully, you put muddy stuff in here, and you pull clean stuff out here. This whole process probably costs $200 an acre foot. Then it costs $100 an acre foot to get it from the Central Valley to San Diego if you pay market rates. So you're into it for what, 300 bucks an acre foot, 325 bucks an acre foot? That's not what we do. We're too smart for that. We pay $900 an acre foot for a big desal plant in Carlsbad. And miraculously, we're smart. We're the only guys in San Diego County that have lots of water. This is truly, truly, truly insane. And my own hope is that this situation resolves itself after a drought. My hope is that if the cabal of Babel, you know, the big thinkers in the state of California, the Cadillac commies in West LA experience a situation where all their landscaping turns into wilted lettuce, that eventually some of them, because they're rich people and they can win that war, the war of the checkbook, might default to a market. Wishful thinking? I don't think so. I think a market is the solution to basin-wide water management. I think a market is the solution to the necessity to force pool an aquifer for the benefit of all water owners. I think a market is the way that you resolve the dispute between a hospital, a golf course, and an almond grove. It may not be the only answer, but I think it's so much better than the answers that have caused what, thank you, the miracle of drought, that it will stand a chance in various parts of the world. It's instructive to note, as I said starting off, that markets are beginning to develop in water. The Darling Basin in Australia, while a very imperfect water market, is so much better than what preceded it, that it is beginning to be adopted in other parts of the world, including prominently northern Chile. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope I haven't taken so much time talking about water that I've reduced your beer consumption this evening. And once again, I'd like to thank Jayant and Rajni for allowing me to speak. Thank you.